Welcome to Amidon Planet. I'm your host, Joel Amidon. Thank you for joining me on this never-ending quest to learn how to teach better. Today on episode 84 of the podcast, we're putting a bow on 2022 and looking forward to 2023. And like some of you are thinking, we're like a dozen days, we're 12 days into 2023. It's too late to keep saying Happy New Year, folks. What are we doing a wrap-up episode on 2022? 2022 was so 2 weeks ago. Well, here's my mindset is I kind of want to do a wrap up to something after it is done, right? So thinking about either a class or a unit or a lesson, to do hey, what did we learn? And we're in the midst of the unit is not good. Even like if we got time left. I was always big when I was teaching high school math, or even to my current college classes, to the chagrin of some of my students, is that I use every minute. Okay, so we're not going to sit around. We're not going to stand. Oh, I'm not going to stand by the door. Ooh, in high school, like kids wanted to get up and stand by the door. No. We're going to use every minute. Okay, use every minute of the class. We don't have that many minutes to use. Let's use every minute. And so, same thing for the 2022. Let's use every minute. I don't like it when Spotify sends me my Wrapped for the year, that it happens at like the beginning of December. Like, hey, here's what you did in 2022 for your listening habits. Here's what's top artists and how many times you listen to this. I'm like, no, hey, 2022 is not over yet. What are you doing? I could really influence that. Man, finals are happening at the beginning of December. I could do some major listening throughout the rest of this December and change all of these metrics. So anyway, or, another way to think about this is that kind of took a break and finally getting to putting out this Wrapped episode. But I'm putting in the other side that, hey, I wanted to wait for the year to be over, take a moment, take a breath, and reflect and think about, well, what happened in 2022? And so that's where we're going to look at that, and then maybe that's going to lead to kind of some plans and some intentions for 2023, and that's what this episode is about. So if you were someone who listened to every single episode of 2022, congratulations, thank you, and maybe this episode might be redundant, but I don't think so. Actually, we're gonna kind of cover some patterns, some things that we might notice, and maybe you have some things. And if you've noticed some things or some patterns in what we're seeing, you can send them to joel@amidonplanet.com. We always love to get some feedback that way. Anyway, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to do a little bit of statistics, not that many statistics, but a little bit of statistics. We had 18 episodes in 2022. There were 18 guests. There wasn't one guest per episode. There's some that were double up, and so we had a solo episode as well. In those 18 guests, we had a rock critic. That was fun. Assistant principal, 3 education consultants, 2 pastors, a musician, a camp director, and 8 professors. So a lot of people in higher ed. Again, that's my profession, so we get a lot of people that way. We talked about a couple books, some podcasts or podcast episodes. We talked about a couple articles about camp, about crime novels or summer reads. We talked about careers, mental health, first aid, high quality instructional materials or HQIMs. We talked about puzzles. We talked about PowerPoints. We talked about learning and teaching a bunch. And so like all those different topics and things, and all aimed at learning how to teach better. And so one thing that I did at the beginning of 2022 was to create a trailer for the podcast. That was the Welcome to Amidon Planet. I guess it's an episode. It was like 2 minutes. Spotify has a trailer thing that you can like identify, hey, here's the trailer for the podcast. And before then, it was using something that I had recorded way at the beginning of almost 4 years ago. Yeah, the podcast's been around for 4 years. Can you believe that? I couldn't believe that. So anyway, when I first started, I was cheap. Again, thinking about trying to be efficient with funds. My first podcast, I guess, service. So you got to put your files up into some sort of distributor that can then get them to all the different services, so like Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, all that sort of stuff. So anyway, the first service I had, I had like 50 megabytes a month that I could use to upload audio. So I was limited to the size of my files. And so, I'd record an episode and had to keep it around a certain length, I think around 45 minutes, 40 minutes, something like that. And then if I had extra, I was like, hey, I'm going to use the extra for, I'm paying for it. I'm going to use it. So I would create so every episode had like a warm up and then a wrap up, like a warm up and a wrap up to each episode. So there was once a month, warm up, episode, and wrap up, and try to keep it within those 50 megabytes. And so Spotify saw one of those warm ups as like my trailer, because I didn't identify a trailer, and that was the shortest one. It was like the beginning of all this stuff, and used that as like my trailer. So I needed to replace that. So I did the Welcome to Amidon Planet at the beginning of 2022, and really all that was basically kind of recalibrating. Hey, what's the purpose of this? And I was actually asked this question yesterday, like, why do you do the podcast? And I do it for a couple of reasons. One is when I'm a big podcast listener first, and as my Spotify rep would say, I listen to a lot of podcasts. And I would hear a lot of talk about books, and usually these books were about business books or some other books. But there's a lot of application towards business that I would say, like, well, yeah, I see that for business, but what is the application towards education? And I would think about that. I'm like, ooh, I'm learning this stuff from this book. Here are the perceived applications I'm having towards education, and I want to talk to people about it. And besides my wife and my classrooms and my kids, who am I going to get to talk to about this? And so, and there are other outlets. I have friends that I could talk to as well. But just like I guess I'm kind of designed to be a teacher, and I want to teach, and I only have so much time within a classroom, and I have certain things I need to teach. So I kind of needed a third space in order to share things. And so that's what started it. So like wanting to have that space. And so like thinking about some of the early episodes of the podcast, like I talked about some stuff from Jocko Willink. We talked about the field experience, the field manual. But then When was a big one. Daniel Pink's book, When it was talking about timing and the importance of timing, and think about like how you work or how timing worked with synchronizing teams together and stuff like that. Like, I saw so many applications towards education in that, and so wanting to share those learnings, and the podcast became a place to do that. 4 years later, here we are in 2022, and we're still trying to figure out, okay, so what are we doing? And so, like, again, that first episode of the year was a trailer saying, hey, this podcast is about all these sorts of things, and like sort of things like outside of the normal education books, because there's a lot of education books, and like I like reading education books, like sharing education books. I've done it many times on the podcast so far, and we get kind of education-y, like talk about like my conversation with Christy Livingston, where we talked about high quality instructional materials. I was very like focused in on education. We got some in the future too, but kind of I like taking these things that are not normally being identified as education related and extracting lessons for learning how to teach better. For example, my conversation with Rob Harvilla that happened in May, that was one I really liked because he said like, one of the first questions he had for me when we started the episode was like, do you have a lot of people that are like rock critics on to talk about learning how to teach better? And like, there is a lot of times when we talk about things that are not necessarily education related and thinking about how to learn how to teach better. But that was a great question by him. And those are the things I like doing, like the podcast episodes that we talked about. The Broken Record podcast had 2 of those, and one of them I had was a solo one of them that I recorded in Kenya, by the way, and then one of them was with Matt Mifflin just this past year. And I like thinking about the creative process and other things, and again, those lessons that can be brought into think about teaching and learning. So anyway, that started off the year in really thinking about kicking off the year with that trailer. What is the purpose of Amidon Planet? Why am I doing it? What is the importance of it, and why do I want to keep doing it? Also, I think it keeps me accountable to keep learning and reading. And like, some of you might be saying, do you need a podcast to do that? No, don't. But it is like, I was thinking like, hey, I got to get another episode out, and I want to say, what am I reading? What am I like taking in? And so even thinking like I've got books that I have read, and I want to share some of these lessons that I've learned from them. Then also too, I get reflected. Like sometimes I read a book and I'm like, you know what? I don't have a lot of lessons from that. And so maybe that really is getting me to gauge like, quality, or also maybe I'm not being as creative in thinking about how to apply certain things. But I don't know, kind of doing some self-reflection as we're talking here. So I wanted to talk about some of the more popular episodes via downloads, but then also too, I think there's a lot of things here that I just want to make sure to highlight, because people either shared or created something that then found some value in it that I wanted to share as well. And so like even thinking like, the first real episode of the year was my conversation with Jeremiah Sims, Love as Praxis, which is awesome because like Jeremiah Sims and some of his authors and editors that led to like basically a collaboration that I am doing with Jeremiah. So we had this initial conversation in February, and it eventually came to be, and I had been introduced to Jeremiah electronically through Patty O'Sullivan here at the university. And, basically we kind of had she saw like, hey, you guys have some meetings of the mind, some common ideas about education. And then Jeremiah came on, and he was like, awesome. Like I could barely hang on. There was so much happening in that episode, like that I needed to actually have him come back. And so actually a couple months later, he comes back and he talks about one of the things that he had talked about was, so he talked about love as praxis on the first episode. And then later on, he talked about these ideal fellows, which got in my head, like as he kind of mentioned it in that first episode. And then later on, he talked about these ideal fellows, which takes this impact framework, which he has, which we talked about in the episode 66. And we thought about how do you take a framework to examine the places and the spaces that you work with people, and think about what are the issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion that maybe you're missing, right? And get a team together and examine that and interrogate what you're doing and how do you get better at it. And then thinking about ideal fellows was like, these are people that are that are engaged in that process, and how do you equip them and encourage them and put them out into the world, into the spaces that they're already in order to help, again, make a difference, right, with regards to those issues. And so, and also, just a preview coming up, he wrote a book with some co-authors and co-editor, and we're going to be talking about that early on in 2023 as well. So excited about that. And again, thankful for Patty introducing me to Jeremiah that then led to these opportunities. Again, that's another reason to have the podcast, is like people are like, hey, I know what Joel's into. And like, I seen some commonalities with this other person. I think he would be a great conversation, a great collaboration, but then also could be something to then share through the podcast with other folks. So also too, then another episode that I was excited to share was my conversation with my friend Jeff Wanko, talking about teaching with puzzles. Like, again, seeing someone that's passionate about something. And so Jeff is very passionate about these puzzles that are not, that basically don't have any words, nonverbal puzzles, basically, like Sudoku, but that's like the one that we're familiar with, but they're all sorts of different sorts of puzzles. And he loves putting them together. He loves to share them and loves to teach with them. And so thinking, I never thought about that before. Actually, I take that back. I would use sort of Sudoku-like puzzles in my classrooms for like to fill space when we were doing like openers. We would do an opener in my math classroom, and then, hey, if you're done with the opener on the back, we've got a puzzle for you to complete. And then I would get kids to think logically, and like they think almost like, oh man, we're getting a chance to do puzzles, when they're doing a lot of math when they're doing those puzzles. And Jeff, and that's just a minor way to do that. But Jeff has some very sophisticated ways of thinking about teaching with puzzles, and so that's episode 67. We already talked about our episode 68, where I talked with Matt Mifflin, who is the musical director of the podcast. He wrote the music that we listened to before and at the beginning and the end of every episode. And we just had kind of was walking the dog, was listening to the Broken Record podcast with Robert Plant and Rick Rubin have a conversation. And I was like, oh my gosh, there's some lessons here. And Matt's my resident musician. And I was like, I want to talk to him about some of these things and see what he thinks about it with regards to lessons from teaching that I extract from that episode. So that was a fun episode. And then I had a chance to talk with a legend, Johnny Lott. That was episode 69 about Johnny Lott was a former NCTM president, the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, and he shared just his story in math education. And just like, again, one of the dirty secrets of the podcast is another reason to do the podcast is I get to have these conversations where I get to like dive into that. Again, some of you are saying, do you need to have a podcast for that? No, I could have these conversations, but one of the values is being able to then share it with others. Because some of you don't know who Johnny Lott is, and some of you are math educators that don't know who Johnny Lott is, and this is an opportunity to hear about what he is and what he did and who he is and what he did and all the things that he did with regards to math and curriculum and then his willingness he then came and shared some of that information with me. He shared not only that with me, he shared a bunch of journals and books with me as well. So I'm very appreciative of Johnny Lott. And again, happy for that opportunity to share. And then we had an episode with my friend Joey Bates, pastor from my church. And we talked about he gave me an opportunity to teach to a group that he's in charge of. It's called The Collective at the Orchard, where people are walking through the Bible together, and I had an opportunity to teach in that, kind of guest teach, and I had some lessons about that, and some of the lessons that I learned and wanted to give an opportunity to share. So I'm glad that Joey came on to share on the podcast when we talked about when Jesus fed the 5,000. How it wasn't just Jesus taking over and being that sage on the stage and saying, hey, I'm feeding you all, versus like, no, he empowered others to do that, right? He let others contribute. He didn't need help, but he allowed others. And there was a really powerful message that maybe sometimes gets overlooked in folks that read the Bible. And so glad that Joey was willing to come on, and we kind of called that the Easter edition. Then we get into episode 71, which is probably one of my favorite conversations. Also, it was probably the longest wait to have a conversation. So Rob Harvilla and 60 Songs That Explain the 90s. 60 Songs That Explain the 90s is one of the podcasts that popped up on my 2022 Wrapped, where from Spotify, which said like, hey, you listen to this podcast an awful lot. And like, yes, I did. And I wanted to have Rob Harvilla to come on to talk about how he is teaching us about the 90s. But then also, too, if you listen to episode 0 or episode 1 all the way through, I think we got up to episode 60 by the time we talked. And then he was going into, they're actually doing 90 songs, but he still calls it 60 Songs That Explain the 90s. We talk about that at the beginning of the episode. Anyway, if you looked at episode 1 to episode 60, you saw an evolution in how he structured those episodes, how he was teaching, I would say, about the 90s, like how he structured it. And you saw there's more story being added into it, more personalization of each of those episodes and how they connected to him and his experiences, and not just a kind of, I want to say sanitized, but just like a not stripped of context sort of. But like, he's just like me. I think we're almost the same exact age. Like we both have like sort of a connection to that time period. And so why take away those experiences, those, memorable experiences, obviously, that is connected to each of those songs that he talks about in his podcast, which is kind of cool because his career ended up being talking about those songs. And you think about as a teenager or as a, young adult, you are experiencing these songs and you're then going to use those in your career later. Like thinking about my own experiences in a math classroom and thinking about how I've used those in my career, or my own experiences as a early teacher and how I can now use those in my career. And so, I don't know, kind of seeing that in how he's helping us understand some of the, and again, it's an entertainment podcast, but there's some important themes and issues that he does talk about within the 90s that, and especially with some of these conversations with the experts that he has to come talk about. Like, there's things that I learned about the 90s, like from all sorts of different aspects that was kind of uncovered in that podcast. Anyway, was excited to have him. Had to wait a long time to get him on the podcast, so I'm glad he was willing to come on and humor me and talk about how he's teaching through the podcast, even though maybe he doesn't think of himself as a teacher, but that's okay. Then we had a chance to talk to, and again, this was a recommended person. Sarah Soonling Blackburn was recommended by Christy Livingston, expert LinkedIn educator that was willing to come in and talk about the model minority myth. And again, a lot of learnings that I had not thought about before, but able to then kind of shine a light on this thing about what is the model minority myth and how does it impact what we do in the classroom, and thinking about that. And also then because of that connection, now on LinkedIn, I'm learning so much. Sarah puts out some great content within LinkedIn. So if you're not connected to her, I would get connected. Go search her up, Sarah Soonling Blackburn. I think there's some links in the episode notes for her, and she puts out great content in LinkedIn about thinking about what is the model minority myth and how do we counteract it within the spaces that we work. Then we go to episode 73. Again, that was a follow-up, the Ideal Fellows as Love in Action with Jeremiah Sims. That was, again, we talked about that episode already. Then I had a chance to, again, this was when I was thinking about episodes that I wanted to have. I have kind of this idea list, and one of them was to have one of my former professors, David Williamson Schaefer, come on and talk about how to make PowerPoints that don't suck. That was a course that I had with him when I was a doctoral student, and that wasn't what the actual name of the course, but that was kind of the unofficial title of the course. And we had a chance to talk about the learnings that we had. And if you're in any way associated with creating images that are supposed to communicate something, that are supposed to teach something, or supposed to keep a handle onto a concept, like that's a awesome episode. I've given that talk so many times of talking of like the lessons that I learned from that course and then sharing it with others. And it's been over and over again, things that people have taken away from some things. Like they might not remember anything else that I've taught, but they might remember that because of the powerful things that he taught within that course. And so I kind of taken the condensed version and shared it with him on episode 74. Then we had another episode, my friend Rosemary Oliphant Ingham, a fellow professor here at the University of Mississippi in the Department of Teacher Education. We talked about summer reading, which we both have a passion for these kind of crime novels, a lot of times in rural spaces. And so we kind of trade them back and forth. So like the ones on Longmire, which is Craig Johnson writes those novels. We have C.J. Box writes about Joe Pickett. And a couple others, there's some others that we like reading. And we just talk about those. And again, what are some lessons we can extract from reading these very popular sorts of novels? And like there's other Lee Child, Jack Reacher, like those novels are pretty popular. And there's lots of different kinds that are not like that. But anyway, these sort of I want to say not rhythmic, but formulaic, there we go. Formulaic novels that are very popular that people like reading. And so we kind of talked about what lessons can we learn about why do we enjoy these things so much, and then what can we apply towards our teaching. That was just a fun conversation. And also, too, she's an expert in reading, and some of the things she talked about within there about reading, and some of you have young kids and you're stressed about are they reading? What are they reading? What do I need to do? Should they be reading this? Should they be reading that? One, she would just say, get them to read. Whatever they want to read, let them read it, right? And so she has some great messages, but that's the one that I really love is just, hey, if they're reading, whatever they're reading, if they're reading the sports page, if they're reading a magazine, if they're reading blogs on how best to defeat some character in a video game, hey, they're reading, okay? And eventually they get to this point of saturation, then they'll read something else, okay? And so letting them read, I just love that episode. I'm glad that Rosemary got a chance to come on. Probably try to get an excuse for her to come on again. Then we talked about had an article come out on math celebrations, which is my kind of form of thinking about assessment. And so article came out that I wrote with a bunch of other folks, but did a solo pod just talking about that episode. So that's there. Then I had an episode 77 where Dr. Ann Monroe came on, the lessons from the Road to Better Teaching. We have another podcast called The Road to Better Teaching, rebranded from The Teacher's Journey, but now we call it The Road to Better Teaching. Anyway, we talked about our first season of that podcast and some of the lessons we learned from it. And that podcast is really about telling stories of teacher development, because teachers are awesome. And, teachers are great problem solvers, but thinking about how do teachers get from inexperienced to more experienced, right? I had a great book that I read called The Dream Keepers. It was actually on an episode of earlier season or earlier year of this podcast. Anyway, The Dream Keepers by Gloria Ladson-Billings. And there was two stories. One about this student teacher, Alex Walsh, and then this other teacher, Ms. Devereaux, I believe. And Ms. Devereaux was like this teacher that like exemplified the tenets of culture relevant pedagogy, what Gloria Ladson-Billings talks about within that book. And that's a real teacher that had real practices that came together and then coined it as culture relevant pedagogy. And then you had Alex Walsh, who was not doing that. He was the opposite. And I remember I always felt like Alex Walsh. Right? I always felt like this inexperienced teacher that's doing it wrong, basically. But I wondered, what was the path to go from Alex Walsh to Mrs. Devereaux? And I think the Road to Better Teaching gets at that, where people, even like there's some of them are current students in our program, or some of them we have experienced educators that come on, and they talk about the lessons that they've learned. What are these mile markers on their development to better teaching, right? And so The Road to Better Teaching. Great title. And so having them talk about that, I think it demystifies that. It makes it seem, it's a little bit of transparency, like, hey, that teacher that came from somewhere, right? And they've developed in a certain way. And so, and what are the experiences that they've had? And then also knowing that, hey, I'm going to have those experiences as well. So Ann and I had a chance to talk about that, extract some lessons, share them with y'all. Okay. Then I had Eric George come on, again, my pastor from, this is another episode that I wanted to have for a long time. So Eric George came on, and we talked about these parenting through powerful moments, and kind of using the book Play the Man by Mark Batterson as a guide for the conversation, where we talked about what are the intentional things we do to teach our young or our kids to be adults, right? How do we do that intentionally? Right, not just by happenstance, not just by accident. How do we lay intentional experiences in the way for our kids to become adults, good adults, right? And so thinking about how do we do that, and that conversation is episode 78. Then episode 79, that was interesting. Jen Wolf, who has been on the podcast before, I basically grabbed her, well, virtually, like she's in Arizona, and said, hey, I have this article that I wrote a while ago that I want to talk about, and would you just be a sounding board for me to talk about it? And so it was basically an article that was a result of, a couple things. One, it was a collaboration with myself and a teacher at a local high school, Morgan Trevathan, and we had a chance with her and Verge Cornelius. We had a grant, and we did some work. And what Morgan wanted to do was learn how to teach in groups, and so we did that, and she learned how to teach. And so like basically the article is like the evolution of her. It was almost like an episode of Road to Better Teaching, where she kind of talks about her growth in learning how to teach with groups and our work together. So we got a chance to share that article. So I wanted to talk about that article. I thought it was pretty powerful. And so Jen came on, and I kind of shared that article, and Jen she always asks great questions. So I was just happy for that conversation. Then we have, here at the University of Mississippi, we have Dr. Stephanie Lusk and Dr. Mandy Perryman, who talked about mental health first aid. So they were offering a training on that. And it was like thinking about how do teachers learn how to provide mental health first aid to students, right? And thinking about, especially coming out of the pandemic, and where, students might be needing a little bit more support. But even without the pandemic, people need help, right? And knowing that maybe a misbehavior is not actual misbehavior, it's just maybe a communication like, hey, I'm struggling with something. I'm struggling with this anxiety. I'm struggling with this loneliness. I'm struggling with this fear. And so they came on and talked about mental health first aid. What is it? And then also some trainings that they were offering here through the University of Mississippi. And then I had a chance the next episode, 81, was Lessons from Camp with Dan Antoine, who is head of programs at E084 Lutheran Bible Camp, which we are big fans. We're attendees. We're hopefully able to go this coming summer. But we love camp, and like just thinking about the things that he does in working with young staff on kind of communicating the DNA and the culture of a place so that they can be a supportive participant and facilitator of people enjoying camp. And so what got me thinking about that is like the lessons that I'm kind of teaching within my space of a teacher education program here at the University of Mississippi, thinking about, well, what is he doing at E084 in helping good campers become good camp counselors, where I'm helping, usually here at the University of Mississippi, I'm helping good students become good teachers, right? Because a lot of times those teachers are the good students, right? And I remember that was one of the big lessons I had to learn is that, hey, I'm someone that enjoyed school, and so, but I'm not teaching people that are all just like me, right? And so same thing for a camp counselor, right? Is like that they're gonna be a camp counselor for folks, for campers that weren't exactly like them. And so there's lessons to be learned there, right? On how do we help folks with those transitions, and how do we do that with excellence? And I had a great conversation with Dan on that. And then episode 82, we already kind of briefly talked about this, high quality instructional materials with Christy Livingston. Again, she was passionate about this. She's probably one of my number one listeners, and she was very passionate about this topic. And we had a chance to talk about that, and actually had a chance to have that episode shared more broadly here in the state of Mississippi through the Department of Education, which was great because they're trying to make some movements on the idea of high quality instructional materials and how do we get those in the hands of teachers so that they can focus in more on the teaching than on the designing of curriculum, which is two very different tasks, right? And so then there's an idea about focusing more energy on the teaching part than the designing part, right? So again, thankful for that conversation. And finally, the last episode of 2022 was another conversation with my friend Shane Bean. Had a chance to talk with him during the pandemic, and so happy to have him on again. And we had a chance to talk about a book that we both love, which is Coach Wooden's Pyramid of Success by John Wooden and Jay Carty. And I don't know, it's one of those books that has stuck with me ever since we read it, and that was probably maybe, I don't know how long ago we read it, 15 years ago maybe. And so the ideas and the definitions and just even just the definition of success that Wooden puts out there is like my definition of success. And so glad to again share that book. So there we go. There's 18 episodes. That's 18 episodes. We talked through them all. So in looking back at 2022, one thing I noticed is there wasn't forced episodes. Sometimes, in the previous years, again, doing this for 4 years now, there might have been episodes where I'm like, well, I read that book, I got to do an episode on it, where I didn't see that this year, where most things were organic, where one, it was a desired episode, like the one with Rob Harville, I wanted to do that. The one with David Winston Schaefer about PowerPoints that don't suck, wanted to do that one for a long time. And so got to get those on the books. But then also other ones where I wanted to share someone's brilliance with others. So like Johnny Lott wanted to share that, or Sarah Soonling Blackburn, when someone's so passionate like Christy that says, hey, you got to get her on, and like, okay. And then she's on, and like, whoa, that was amazing. So not forced, but taking advantage of opportunities to, again, share someone's brilliance with others, or Jeff Wanko and how he likes to talk about puzzles and be like, hey, would you be willing to share that with my audience? And my hope is that whoever comes on the podcast finds it as an enjoyable experience and also experience value, like the conversation about learning how to teach better. Maybe they see a side of what they do from our conversation that adds value back into what they do, like just the questions that are asked or the perspective that I take hopefully adds value to that. And so again, not forced. Hopefully we're finding value from both sides. It's a win-win around. And then also too, that those that are listening to these episodes find value in them as well. I know I'm growing as a teacher educator, maybe even as a podcaster, and trying to think about, well, what's a good value going forward? And so for 2023, I want to talk about, well, basically there's a book that kind of captures what I want to talk about, and it's called Impact with Integrity, Repair the World Without Breaking Yourself by Becky Margiotta. I kind of want to have Becky on to talk. But anyway, that title, Impact with Integrity, Repair the World Without Breaking Yourself. So self-care, making a difference, keeping true to yourself, right? And thinking about who I am here is who I am in all spaces, right? Like that kind of captures what I want to do in 2023 is talk about those sorts of themes over the course of the year. And so you're going to see, we're going to, talk about some things like, for example, organizations, how they do things with excellence, right? And thinking about either mission and vision and how do you make that into action, right? And thinking about too, doing those sorts of things, but in a space where if you are removed from that space, that everything that you did or believed in doesn't leave with you, right? Because we have, there's lots of transitions that happen. And so thinking about, well, what happens when I transition out of a space? Is some of the good stuff that I have done, does all that leave with me or does some of it remain? And how do we do that? Especially thinking about it teaching. Like I'm teaching teachers. My hope is that when those teachers leave my classroom, that they take a bit of me with them, right? And hopefully if I'm doing good things. So again, but doing it with sustainability. And so there's thinking about self-care and thinking about how do we do that in healthy ways, right? So that's where we want to go with 2023. All right, that's enough from me. You're going to get some episodes. There's some in the hopper already, and we're looking forward to starting off with a bang. Even though we're 12 days in. 12 days into 2023, we're excited for what this year has to offer. Excited for what it has to offer to you, listeners. Hopefully, if you are wanting to interact, you can send something to the mailbag. Love that the mailbag exists, and hopefully we're getting people to take advantage of that. So if you're looking for episode notes, well, if you're looking for all these episodes that I've talked about, you can just go into wherever you got this podcast, just look back at the feed, and you can see the date that things are published, and you can find them all. They're all right there. We'll also put links to them in the show notes, and show notes for this episode can be found at amidonplanet.com/episode 84. And if you're looking for ways to support the podcast, submit something to the mailbag. Question, comment, suggestion. As you can see, as you heard, suggestions that have been given to me have been turned into podcast episodes. So I'm very thankful for those. And it helps make the podcast even better because it tailors it to things that people see and are experiencing out in the world. And we can bring those in and talk about them on the podcast. So you can send those suggestions or anything to the mailbag at joel@amidonplanet.com. You can also subscribe, rate, and review and share this episode or any other episode that you've heard, which will allow more people looking for similar content. That's a great way to support the podcast. As always, you can follow at Amidon Planet on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, or like the Amidon Planet Facebook page. In addition, you can subscribe to the Amidon Planet download containing teaching resources and updates from Amidon Planet. And finally, check out the Amidon Planet store, Amidon Planet bookshop. Links are in the footer at amidonplanet.com, where your purchases support the production costs of the podcast. Finally, thank you for spending time on Amidon Planet. Thanks to Matt Mifflin for the music in this episode. And finally, thank you to all of you out there learning to teach better and be the good in the world by investing in the lives of others. This world is a better place because you have decided to use the gifts you've been given to serve others. Thank you for all that you do. Peace.